Hello, welcome back. I'm Paul Unger, editor of PlaceTech. Today I'm joined by Jeremy Hinds, planning director at Savills, the real estate advisor. If you've listened to the podcast and video Jeremy did with us earlier this year, you'll know Jeremy is very interested and concerned about generating a really meaningful conversation in real estate about what is being done to prepare our towns, cities and buildings for more extreme weather events such as flooding and heat waves, and of course helping to reduce carbon emissions. And we're joined by Tom Cheesewright, an applied futurist. That means Tom helps businesses think about change and how to prepare for disruption coming into their industries. More on what that means and whether I got that right later. Jeremy, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
Everyone in real estate is talking about ESG now. So what's the problem here?
What's the problem? I think the problem is not that people are not talking about it, but the problem is there's a lack of a framework to understand what the problems really are and how an appropriate response might be formulated to deal with issues that are being faced. So it's a framework issue rather than just a knowledge issue. But I also suspect that we don't have a framework in place because some of the requirements to do something are actually very, very challenging. At some point in this conversation, I'm going to talk about tomatoes, which I know Tom is particularly keen to talk about, in order to illustrate the complexity of the point. But I'll let that hang there for a moment.
Okay. Well, it's only an hour from lunch, so that's already making me hungry. But yeah, Tom, you have some interesting evidence of tomatoes and pizza that we might.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favourite ever projects. I get sucked into all sorts of things looking at the future. A lot of it around property and construction, both directly with organisations in that field, but actually indirectly as well. Most of my clients are sort of in the global 500. They obviously have a lot of property, whether it's owned, leased, or whether they're actually building it themselves or making the materials for it. So we get sucked into these conversations about ESG from every dimension. And I think that's probably one of my biggest concerns is around the life cycle conversation. I feel like we're starting to have we're aware now of acute issues down the line, but not doing preventative stuff now in order to address them early. It's a bit like with our health. I know at some point I'm probably going to have issues because I eat not tomatoes, but too many fried things. But it's pretty hard to do anything about it now to get the motivation. So at some point I'm going to end up in an acute ward having something done about it. And the same is true with our property. I think we need to be doing the property equivalent of eating a better diet, more tomatoes, however they are grown,
or cooked
and fewer bacon sandwiches.
Okay, and so Jeremy, tell us about this framework. What are some of the really big problems that real estate needs to be grappling with now?
Well, just before coming to that particular point, picking up first on Tom's position about something becoming acute. The point about a framework is to understand that we need to have a policy that deals with the issues in a way that provides for consensus amongst everybody. Because we're dealing with spaces, we're dealing with buildings, we're dealing with matters that affect people's lives directly and for a relatively long period of time. Buildings aren't built to be demolished in a matter of a small number of years. That we want buildings and places to live for a significantly longer period, and so we need consensus about what it is that this framework will look like. Now, my concern about it is that the longer we delay having an informed debate, the more likely it is that we end up creating situations where individuals, either people or organizations, start to challenge what's going on or not going on and start creating their own policy positions. And those policy positions will be initially adopted by more radical people. And we're seeing plenty of evidence across the spectrum of that right now. And the more you have a radical policy response, the more you start to alienate or you create counter radical responses. And the longer it takes, therefore, and the more difficult it it becomes to create a consensus-based approach. So rather than just deal with it in a framework sense, we need to have two debates going on at the same time. One is looking at three debates really. What are the problems? What are the solutions? And of those solutions, which ones are we prepared to buy into, and which ones work for us?
Yeah.
And because we're dealing with in this conversation, we're dealing with impacts of environmental impact, and which are characterized by habitat loss and global warming. You can't have a policy response that just deals with one matter and think that is a solution. And you can't deal with it really in just one local authority or indeed one country. It has to be formulated at a level that carries a very large number of both people and countries and understands what's going on.
So can you give us an example to illustrate what you mean by a radical response or a radical policy idea that some people might gather around, just so we can picture it?
Well, let's go back to tomatoes and understand why is that an issue. So look at it in terms of carbon. So if we're dealing with the carbon as the question, we want to get to a point where we're saying we don't want to produce carbon, or we have net zero. So if I want to have tomatoes on my salad in January, then it's going to be a product that's grown in a greenhouse, probably in the Netherlands, almost certainly in the Netherlands, and it's a vast greenhouse. And in order to produce that tomato, I've got a fertilizer system which is hydroponic. So I've got nitrates extracted from the atmosphere using methane. I've got an artificially high carbon dioxide environment inside the greenhouse. I've got heaters to keep the greenhouse warm. And then I've got to transport that tomato in order to it be fresh on the plate in Manchester. It's got to be in a cold environment, which in turn will be brought about through the use of fossil fuels. So you can look at the tomato as a fossil fuel product. If we want to go into net zero for carbon, we've got to look at every stage of that process. And we've got to say, are we prepared to change the way in which we grow and therefore fuel the system? And I know Tom's going to say something about solar production, which is fine, but that's only one part of that entire journey. So the framework and therefore the answers begin to look at, well, we have to transition. We can't just suddenly say we're going to stop growing tomatoes, for example. The whole infrastructure and industry is based around it.
So go back to seasonal food on the shelves.
Indeed, but because you've got infrastructure that is created around this whole product, it's not just tomatoes, it's cucumbers and it's peppers and so on. A radical response, answering your question, might be, well, in that case, why don't we pay the farmers not to produce tomatoes in January, February, March when it's too cold and they need artificial heating, and just leave it to warmer times and do it that way? You could say, why don't we, through the United Nations, buy up huge tracts of land, say the Amazon forest, and dedicate that to, and so dedicate that to preservation. So you have different financial frameworks need to be contemplated in order to get from A to B, where A is where we are today and B is where we want to get to in terms of net zero. You can't just do that with a policy framework that doesn't explore some of the key financial implications of the decisions that are being made or have to be made.
I think my concern here, and it's in some way, the growing of tomatoes is an incredibly complex industry. The food industry, I do a lot of work in the food industry. It's incredibly complex. In some ways, it pales into insignificance against the complexity of property and construction because of the diversity of suppliers, the diversity of stakeholders. Across public and private, individual, whether it's from your tenants, the people walking by the street, the people upon whom a piece of concrete might fall, the workers on the site, the energy suppliers, the concrete suppliers going into it. It's an incredibly complex process. And my concern about a framework, or trying to do a really, really consistent framework, is trying to bring all those stakeholders together. And I think in some ways what you want is you either take one of two approaches. You say the market will define. And so we've got some people doing this right now. We've got people building what they hope are going to be green buildings, office buildings, for example, and they believe they're going to be still of a good standard. The market will treat them as a good standard in 30 years. And they're doing that and bearing the extra cost of doing it on the grounds that this is an asset that will have greater longevity. that will have greater appeal to a particular group of organizations now, ones for whom ESG is a high priority, and increasingly it is driven by actually shareholders who are acknowledging that there is a sort of material risk to both profit and perception of the organization if the company doesn't take those things seriously. And so that, the market's going that way now. Meanwhile, we've got loads of existing stock on the market which doesn't meet those standards. And actually, we're building a lot of stock which doesn't meet those standards, whether that's in residential, whether that's in office, whether that's in industrial. And so, you say, okay, the market will sort this out, and eventually everyone's going to demand things of a particularly high standard with regards to climate, carbon performance? Or do we say, actually, we have to regulate, whether it is self-regulate through a sort of industry framework or actually governmental or even international regulation that says these are the standards that you must meet? And to some extent, we're doing that already. We have a set of standards for 2030 and beyond. And do we rely on these standards to drive that progress? And my concern about that is just speed. Does the market move fast enough to meet the challenges we face if it is only reliant on the regulation? Particularly, come back to property as a particular example, given how fragmented the value chain is. You've got people getting in, doing their job, getting out. And, while some people are on the hook for the performance of that building for the next 30 years, some people absolutely aren't.
But the UK is placed, very well placed, in fact, to actually begin to understand how that fragmented basis of construction and placemaking, we are well placed to address it through the local government arrangements that are in place. So we've got a planning system that has been tinkered with for goodness knows how many times now. And I mean,
it's a very polite way of putting it.
It's being recorded. So and because it's been tinkered with, I think it's also lost its way. I think it's very difficult to understand what, if you ask a planning consultant and a planning professional in local government what is planning about, you'll get completely different answers. And some people don't even know what to say. So, but I think we can empower our systems in the UK to deal with the fragmented approach and say, we've got this regulatory framework. Let's recalibrate this framework to deal with these issues at this sort of macro level, and let the market respond accordingly at its micro level. The market's very good at picking up the direction of travel. Is very, very good at that. You don't want that to somehow disappear. But the market's also very good at ignoring the direction of travel.
Well, that's the case in point, isn't it? Because everyone's talking about it, but we're still building buildings the same way and building dirty buildings, let's call them. So why is that? And who is the onus on? Is it on the policymakers to set planning, use the carrot and stick analogy is it the planning sticks? Is it the market carrot? And why hasn't corporate real estate really taken this seriously yet from the conversations that you have with clients and people coming for advice? Is it just lip service?
No, I think Tom would agree. Actually, I don't think it is lip service. No. I think people are genuinely concerned. The conversation is credible at its core. People want to do something. The problem is people don't know what to do. And you're right, Tom. If you've got people who are making strenuous efforts to deal with it in terms of individual buildings and so on, that's great, but it's an individual building. We need this to be elevated rapidly upscale. So it's not just down to one or two individuals and funders behind that.
And I think part of the problem is actually complexity. Just doing, for example, the downstream or rather the upstream calculations on carbon footprint of a construction process is incredibly difficult. Once you get into your sort of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, what is powering the diggers on my site? What sort of cement is being used in the concrete that we're pouring? Is the rebar coming from 50% recycled steel, 100% recycled steel? Was it done in a blast furnace or an arc furnace? I mean, there's a huge amount of complexity here. And I don't think we yet have the tools to do that analysis very easily. Certainly not to the point that it doesn't add an incredible level of friction and administration to the top of what is already a complex process. And when you're trying, particularly when you've got this, I keep coming back to in this industry, there's a very sort of fragmented value chain. Lots of people in it get rewarded at particular points and then they're out and they're not really responsible for the lifetime value of the building. While that's the case, it's very difficult to incentivize them to actually to bear that additional cost. Let's be honest, to recruit those additional skills, which often aren't out there. FP&A, financial planning and analysis people, the sort of people you need to do that accounting, are thin on the ground. And people with the skills to use the tools to do that are thin on the ground. Convincing the people at the construction phase, the project management phase, even the architecture phase to do that additional work, unless they're going to be rewarded for it, is really challenging.
And not all companies, a lot of what the Americans would call the mom and pop companies, which make up the bulk of the industry, they can't necessarily afford that. But also there's a systemic problem in property that once a lease is signed, the landlord doesn't have permission to automatically go over the threshold into the tenant's demise and start asking for all their energy performance and telling them how to use what to do with the lighting and the power. So very, very complex and difficult problem.
But I think precisely because it's complicated, we ought to look at this, I think, from a slightly different perspective. The trouble with acknowledging its complexity is, and this is why I think the answer to your question much earlier about why aren't things happening, is because it's so complicated. Everyone goes, oh no, I can't really deal with this, and pushes it down the line. So I think the way around the problem is to try and get some really easy, quick wins in and change it really, really quickly, but from another end. So you could, going back to the planning, we could say, for example, all new housing you can't have bedrooms with south-facing windows or something. So solely that when you get, like we have had this year, very high temperatures, you actually create the circumstances inside a house where people will get respite from very high temperatures. Because we now know, and we've always known, but we now experienced it in the UK, that high daytime temperatures followed by high nighttime temperatures is what causes a lot of heat stress. So you could create some very easy policy solutions that says that is what we are going to do. That's going to change the way in which we understand how we use our houses. That's not a particularly radical proposition, other than the context that we don't currently do that.
Yeah. So
it's radical in the sense of direct intervention about what you cannot do at state level, and there's a natural reaction against the state telling you how you have to design. And the state has made many examples on design issues in the past, so there's form, but it's the lack of the debate that allows the consensus of that would naturally, I think, flow. You could say all new housing has to have external shutters or something. Or you could say if you want to have windows on the south side, then you've got to have shutters. Or you can create solutions, but until you start breaking it down, until you deal with address the fragmented components and start getting people to understand what you can do, without that, I just don't think we're going to have the consensus to deal with it actually at the big level and the combined level.
I think you're right. I mean, I think there are some. I think policy interventions are kind of the only way. We have to have some policy intervention. And I think you're right. I think there are some quite simple ones that would quickly have a big impact. And in some ways, by regulating on some specifics, you might start to change the more general mindset. Yeah. Sure, some people will approach it in a tick box fashion. Yeah. Okay, I've got to let me find the cheapest shutters and screw some shutters on.
Indeed.
But actually, slowly as you start to build up these things around levels of insulation, personally, I think most homes being built now should be energy self-sufficient. There's no reason they can't be, to a large extent. If you start to regulate on those things, the marginal costs at the point of construction are still, and I might probably get shot down for this, but relatively small. Certainly for some of those things. If you're building a house to add shutters and, better insulation and go for low U value windows, those things are relatively marginal costs particularly if you're doing a large site. And in regulation is the only way we're going to get people to do that, partly because it's just inertia that stops them. we've always done things this way. I know how to do things this way. I've got a good deal with my suppliers. I can do it in volume. Why should I change what I'm doing unless I'm forced to?
And it's short-termism as well, isn't it? Going back to that point, it's why we're not very good at saving, and we're not very good at dieting. We want the sort of instant result.
Yeah, it's the Father Ted thing. He's looking at the two cows, and very different between the small one close up and the large one far away. I think David Spiegelhalter is very good on this. We're not very good at understanding large long-term risks versus small short-term risks. And again, that's where government has to come in, because government should be the one looking at large long-term risks and regulating for it.
So are politicians guilty of that short-term view as well?
I don't think it would be a novel thing to say that. Yeah, absolutely. The terms of Parliament have in many ways defined the sort of the legislative cycle. And it's a bit like, we started to see, particularly post 2008, lots of the companies I was speaking to would only make buying decisions if they were going to see return on investment in 12 to 18 months. Well, I'm only going to spend money. I can only spend money my boss will only allow me to spend money if I will see return on investment in this in 12 to 18 months. And so, lots of long-term investments that would have been improved infrastructure, but we would have a long-term payback, weren't made. And I think we're paying for that now. I think a lot of companies are paying for that now. And likewise in politics, we've got to the point in an electoral cycle or electoral culture where people won't make long-term decisions because they're focused on whatever will get them through a next election. And it's why, energy is a good example. Why have we not made the investments in energy infrastructure that we needed to avoid the situation we're in now? It's because it wasn't particularly, governments ideologically, or because they didn't think it would be politically popular, didn't want to spend the billions of pounds it required to build new nuclear. They didn't want to have the political fight with people who objected to wind farms. And they didn't want to spend the money on the primary research to get us to a point where we had effective energy storage technologies.
And I accept that. At Paul's point, I agree with, as human beings, we're still wired up to be short-term and immediate gratification, all the rest of it. And we have electoral systems that actually serve that same purpose. But if we had the conversation, if we had the debate at a level where we're going to say, this is the framework, these are the things we need to do, then actually the electoral framework would buy into that. So it would say, it doesn't matter now. We know this is going to go beyond another 5 years and another 5 years, but at least the framework is there. At least the conversation is there. And that would allow the politicians to orchestrate their own positions on individual matters, whether it be habitat loss, whether it be creating spaces, whether it be dealing with what type of concrete, whatever they want to do. They can at least do that within a understandable framework or context, and it sort of takes the fear out of the debate, as it were.
I mean, the really radical thing for them to do, which they won't do because it's an inherently political act, is to do what we've done with the Bank of England and do what we've done with the Office of National Statistics, and it extracts climate policy out into a technocratic organisation that says, look, 99.99% of the world scientists agree. We can see what the impacts are going to be. Let's regulate on the grounds of, here's a set of objectives. We've got to hit net zero by this time. Yeah. And we want to, improve our energy security, and we don't want lots of people to die from heat stroke or, freezing to death in winter or starving. Right? What policies do we need? Here are the regulatory levers under your control. Let's stick it all in an Office for Climate Change policy and, take it out of the political conversation.
Yeah.
But that would require political consensus, which I don't see on the near horizon.
The Bank of England is a great example of something that has stayed through successive governments since 1998. It's been independent. Let's hand it to the experts. It was seen as a good thing, a sensible move. And
the big challenge facing it now, and the same thing would be true of an Office for Climate Change, is that the levers at the disposal of the Bank of England are not sufficiently large to offset international forces that are causing our current situation. And so, power effectively reverts back to government because control of interest rates isn't sufficient to control inflation anymore. Because we're in such a globalized economy. The same is true for climate change. Yes, we could become a paragon of virtue in the UK doing all the things we need to do, and we should. but we're still going to be reliant on national politicians to negotiate internationally to drive the global picture forward.
100%, but we can't escape the fact that the impact is felt by you, by me.
Yeah.
It's felt by us as individuals, and it's
and in property, we could do a lot of mitigation that would offset that impact. We have to do a lot of mitigation to offset that impact.
But there are still other things we could do. I mean, Paul, you and I have just come back, not having gone together on holiday by pure chance. We're both in Sicily, and we went to some of the oldest. I mean, that island contains some of the oldest buildings on the planet still, which is quite remarkable. But the urban environments that you were able to walk down, it's 35, 40 degrees centigrade, but you're walking in shade, and you can feel the relief as you're walking down in a shaded street with relatively narrow, and what breeze there is sort of travels down this enclosed street. We don't have a similar approach in this country to dealing with the weather events that we are now experiencing, and instead we're still doing the same thing that we've always done. And the reason why we're doing that, again, it sounds like a bit like a broken record, but we don't have a conversation that says, what do we want our towns and cities now to look like? What are the materials that we're going to use to build the buildings that we're going to live in and are going to help us tolerate the environment that's emerging or has emerged? I don't know. As we've discussed before, the idea of spaces between residential buildings is largely based upon post-Victorian Edwardian understandings of what is the appropriate space between buildings
to minimise the miasma.
It's just silly.
So given the situation, and we are seeing companies already going into another difficult economic climate and cutting sustainability measures, they're facing cost of living on a grand scale, the cost of doing business when you look at energy bills, etc. So some worrying short-term moves there, things being factored out of projects. What can we do to bring people to the conversation other than podcasts like this, the content we do on PlaceTech and your own work? How can the industry and the business people from property listening in, how can they start to gather their own stakeholders and players around the conversation?
And I think that is a challenge to leadership, really, because it can't be left, for all the reasons, Tom, you've been saying, it can't be left down to individuals constantly making what might well be the right choice. There has to be a sense of national leadership, has to be a sense of, it doesn't just have to be political leadership, it can be business leadership as well, but there needs to be a sense where people can say, this is the conversation we need to have. These are the things we can do now, and these are some of the changes we might need. There will be then outflows from that, which could include policy and legislative responses. They could include financial and taxation responses. So it's how do you start to generate that debate and create all the other flows of conversations that will be needed to change the way people operate. So going back to tomatoes, and I know it's not relevant to building a space, but it is, even if growing tomatoes is a very complicated process. If that's complicated, then everything else is even more so, for all the reasons Tom you've been saying.
And Tom, you must come across the sort of change culture, leadership challenges, the internal politics. So what works from your experience that you've seen?
I mean, I think leadership is really important. I think you do need ideally a leader from the top who, if nothing else, creates space for change, who says that I'm not here to dictate, I'm here to ask questions, I have an open mind, who gives people both the time and the confidence to innovate and experiment. And so that sort of that change can sort of bubble up. And I've seen great examples of innovative culture. I mean, still the one I refer to a lot is actually Bromford, the housing association, who has a full-time innovation team with a fixed budget, which is a percentage of revenue, who take ideas from tenants and from people across the organisation, prototype them, test them with a second party, come back to the first team, fully prototype them, test them again, and then if they're good, they roll out. And they do that constantly, and it's become part of sort of culture of innovation, a part of culture of change. But one thing I wanted to pick up on, which from all the things I thought you said there, which I completely agreed with, the one bit that's missing here is an aesthetic conversation. And this might sound a little bit hippie, but what you said about how do we want our cities to look? I think one of the big challenges, and this is probably true more in a resi sense than it is in a sort of corporate industrial sort of office sense, is that there hasn't been a consistent new aesthetic for British architecture. I'm not an expert in this, but I haven't seen evidence of a coherent movement, a coherent sort of architectural movement in response to the change of times. I'm thinking, who's the new Le Corbusier? Who is going to say, like, here's what buildings that deal with climate change look like. This is how we're going to make them stylish. This is how we're going to make them appealing. This is what a vision for a future British city could look like. And it will be a uniquely British vernacular. And it would have, I think, enormous support if it tied into particularly sort of younger age groups who are going to be the customers for these buildings in the future.
Le Corbusier, the famous British architect.
I know too little about architecture to name a British equivalent.
But you never know. The timing of this might be interesting, given as he then was Prince Charles's interest on the aesthetic, and I know he is maintaining as king that he won't intervene in the same way that he did, but there are many speaking for him who are strongly suggesting he won't let that go. And I think if Wright were to be on his side, then it is now, in the sense both of the rationale for what he was trying to create, Poundbury and others, and also which is an aesthetic response, but also his environmental point lying behind it as well.
But there's an odd conflict between those two, I would argue. I mean, do we want British cities to look like Poundbury? No.
Neoclassical pastiche.
I mean, it's, no. I'll just leave it there.
It's not very high-rise or dense, is it?
Neither. But equally, you'd say, do you want them to look, and apologies to people from Milton Keynes and those who espouse it, but do you want it to look like that as well? To which I think that many would say no, in the sense of it's a car-born, styled city environment.
I think it's an interesting point, and I think in the social media age, having things that people can latch onto that can be shared, that are visual, that you can easily grasp, a diagram, an image, something people can picture and have an opinion on, as they do with architecture. But the concept architecture is very important for it to get public ownership and drive the policy, and then politicians might want to do it because it looks popular.
But we've got taking your social media point, we actually do have the tools through geographical information systems and computer modeling systems to actually allow that debate to be at last visually presented, using the platforms of social media as well, whereas it's always been a words-orientated conversation, a local plan or a development plan or some form of description of, because it's very difficult to have a drawing and convey the drawing in the absence of social media networks. So with those in place, that debate can actually take place. But I would think it should be taking place in the context of we need to design places and we need to design buildings that deal with energy demands. And we need to make sure that people can enjoy the external environment in a way that is currently not possible in some instances. So, and that might be looking at continental European ways of constructing cities and towns, rather than looking at tall buildings with lots of glass and require lots of cooling down in summer, lots of heating up in the winter, which are very, very expensive. The trouble with energy is it's not a classic economic product. If you put up the price of tomatoes, you might choose not to buy tomatoes, but the energy doesn't have a substitute. So we've got to deal with it. I mean, you either pay more or go cold. There isn't a substitute for energy. So we need to move the conversation in a way that allows us being everybody. How do we use our spaces, our buildings in a way that minimizes demands on energy? as well as making them very comfortable and beautiful, and that's a challenge.
And I think that aesthetic point's really important. It would be a really interesting way to engage people in this conversation, a much broader audience who gives us both that potential for a consensus, but actually the political power that it needs to drive consensus through as well.
Yeah.
You need a weight of opinion to drive these behaviours forward.
Great. Really, really interesting. And we could have another whole series and talk about, energy prices we've hardly touched on. But let's finish with your futuristic pizza project, favorite project.
Yeah.
And how did you grow your tomatoes?
So I was commissioned by an organisation to work out what the future pizza would look like. Very relevant to this conversation because a lot of what we looked at was influenced by climate change. And so we're going to see probably the disruption of wheat growing. So we swapped out 30% of the wheat in the base for insect flour. Upset an awful lot of Italians. My Instagram was an unpleasant place to be for a while. And we swapped out the tomatoes for ones that had been grown in hydroponics, but in an urban farm. So using coconut matting as a growing medium, were artificially inseminated effectively and were grown using entirely sort of solar power and water in a clean environment. So no pesticides.
Grown indoors.
Grown indoors, yeah. But grown close to the consumer. So actually you're not growing them out in the countryside or in the Netherlands and shipping them. They're actually grown in a warehouse behind the supermarket.
And how did it taste?
Gorgeous. It was very, very, I have to say the best bit, the worst bit was the vegan cheese, which was horrendous, but was all right cooked. But the tomatoes were lovely. And the best bit was the base. I have to say the insect flour was delicious, really nutty.
Okay, we'll take your word for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you to Jeremy Hinds from Savills.
Thank you.
And thanks Tom Cheesewright.
Pleasure.
For joining me today. I've been Paul Unger, editor of PlaceTech. I'll see you again soon, folks. Thank you.